Thank you all for joining us. Steve, thank you for being here. We didn't plan this around one of the biggest storms in the history of Southern California. And I imagine that's been keeping you up late the last few days. But so that we're doubly appreciative of you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Also wanted to just elaborate a little bit on what Gavin mentioned. We, as a school, went through a comprehensive strategic planning process, and we identified priorities that we felt where Anderson could be truly distinctive. And one of the themes, as Gavin pointed out, of the strategic plan was to elevate the public mission and to take on large societal challenges. And two that we've prioritized is health access and cost, which is a very large societal problem. And then, of course, sustainability issues, which may be arguably, in fact, maybe not arguably at all, the social challenge of the century, really. And so we're really pleased that you can be here, also as a double Bruin and an alum from our MBA FEMBA program. We're thrilled that you're on the frontier of solutions to these large problems. So thanks again.
Thank you.
The way I'm going to proceed is I have some questions for Steve, and then we receive some questions from students, and I'll ask some of those as well. Okay, great. So California's goal is to reach 90% clean electricity by 2035, 95% by 2040, and then 100% by 2045. So what's Southern California Edison's plan to meet those goals, and are you on track?
Sure. Let me start by saying thank you for having me. It's really exciting. I haven't spent much time back on campus over the last 2 decades, or decades since Anderson, but it's great to be kind of re-engaged and frankly share just some of what we're doing at Edison. The state has goals for the electric sector, and you mentioned 90% clean electricity by 2035, going to 100% by 2045. That's part of a bigger, broader plan, though, for their broader decarbonization. So let me start with that broader plan. State needs to be carbon neutral by 2045. 85% of the carbon reductions, or you need 85% reduction in human-caused emissions around GHG and other carbon. We've done a lot of work over the last 6 years, mapping out what has to happen in the state for that to happen. And yes, it's 100% clean electricity, but that clean electricity needs to be used to fuel electrification. So by 2045, 90% of vehicles need to be electrified, 95% of buildings need to be electrified, which then creates an 80% growth in utility-served electric demand. So on top of the energy we serve today, it's 80% more electricity, and it has to be 100% carbon-free. Right now, SCE is served, it's about 50% carbon-free in terms of what we deliver. You've got hydro, you've got a little bit of nuclear still coming from Arizona. We've got a growing amount of renewables in that mix, but there's still a lot of natural gas that needs to be taken out of the system. We don't own most of our generation, and so we have to go procure it, meaning we're signing contracts for a new generation across the state. So we're out signing contracts for more solar, more wind. That's big parts of the solution. That has to be backed by energy storage. So in terms of getting to carbon-free electricity, primarily a lot of solar, a lot of wind, and a lot of batteries. You can't do it all with those, though. Wind, don't have enough probably capacity in the state, so you're looking at a lot of offshore wind as a big opportunity in the long run. That has to pan out, and it doesn't exist today. There'll be a lot of land use around the solar pieces, and so we've got to make sure that we're developing that. We're signing the contracts, it has to show up. Right? And so that's our plan, is to go and buy as much of that as possible. In the long run, you're going to need a few other technologies to hit that frankly aren't ready at an affordable scalable price right now. So solar, wind, but what's going to be that consistently delivered energy when the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing? Geothermal can advance. You can have enhanced geothermal that can feed in, but the breakthroughs still need to happen there. Carbon capture and sequestration is another one people look at. Not ready to happen at a good economic price today. And then finally, a lot of people ask about nuclear. And so we think nuclear has a future. The question is when and at what price point. And so that'll be some of the big challenges. In the near term, through 2035, it's a whole lot of the renewables that we talk about.
You know, as that, following up on that, as you know, the frontiers of those technologies change and the cost structure change, how do you stay nimble these seem like bets that you have to make well in advance, but these technologies evolve quickly. How do you stay nimble in an environment with all these different alternatives?
Yeah, I think nimble's all a relative thing, right? Because like you mentioned, we're building big infrastructure. Getting a nuclear plant built, I can't tell you how long it'll take to build a nuclear plant.
Never.
Well, in California, you have to have a solution for spent fuel before you can build a nuclear plant. So California is likely behind other states in the country in terms of when you would see nuclear. Any of these, though, they're 10 plus year investments. And so one thing you have to do is it can't be just us. It can't be just the state. It really is national and global solutions. And so we have to work through the Electric Power Research Institute with our peers so that everybody's placing different bets and we're learning along the way. And then at some point, we are going to have to place some bets. Those can be really big bites and big bets to take for companies like a big electric utility. So we've got to work with our regulators to make sure we've got the right risk profile around those investments. So it's a lot of staying I'd say making the investments in the things we know work today that will bridge us for the next 10 years. We've got a lot of work to do to bring the next technologies around that will backstop that.
Great. I know one issue that a lot of people are talking about since, I believe by 2035, all new cars and light trucks in California are going to have to be zero emission.
Right.
So obviously that's going to involve a lot of electric vehicles. Is the grid going to be ready for that?
It better be. That's our job, is to make sure it's ready.
And also there's kind of a rural urban divide as well, since you'd have to have the grid ready, throughout the state. What are your thoughts on our ability to get the grid ready for that giant transformation?
Yeah. So my thoughts are we got to get going fast and we got to do it differently than we've been doing it. When I talked about those numbers, load growth, so we expect to see 80% more utility served electricity in the state by 2045, about a 30% increase by 2035. When we look at that, we're going to need to build transmission lines at 4 times the rate that we've been building in the last 2 decades. We're going to need to build new distribution circuits at 10 times the rate we've been building those. So those are some big numbers and big increases relative to what we've been doing before. Building a new transmission line can take 15 years easy today. We have to change that. So how do we get ready? There's a part of scaling our resources, scaling up our operations to be able to go and implement and execute that. And we've doubled the amount of distribution infrastructure that we deploy over the last 7 or 8 years. We know we can figure out ways to scale the resources to do it. We're going to need help though from, we're going to need changes in siting and licensing to accelerate those. We're going to need alignment with our state regulators. We're going to need to build in advance of demand. Historically in our industry, you wait to see customers show up or you see the demand there and you have a lot of certainty it's going to be there and then you build the infrastructure. We don't have time to do that anymore. And so it's getting agreement from our regulators that, hey, we have to be able to build in advance. We have to get authority to actually build it and get get cost recovery on it. We've got to streamline siting licensing. When we talk about what needs to happen with the grid, I talk about it being reliable, resilient, and ready. Those are the 3 components that we really focus on. Reliability. With as much electricity usage as there will be, you're seeing customers that will be 2 to 3 times more dependent on electricity. It's going to have to be more reliable than it is. So we've got to update the aging infrastructure that's been out there for 80 years in some cases, and we've got to provide more modernization, automation, sensors, smarts in the grid so it can adapt. Resiliency. That's resiliency. Most recently, you talked about resiliency to wildfires. Preventing wildfires, but being resilient and seeing more wildfires. It's resiliency to storms like we saw right now. We've done a lot of investment in our grid. We didn't really have more than 10,000 customers out throughout most of the storms this week, which is very different than it would have been a decade ago. So getting that resiliency so you can adapt to the climate changes as well as adapt to cyber and physical threats that'll be happening. And then there's the readiness, and that is getting visibility into where the load is going to show up. Customers need to contact us early. If a customer has an electric vehicle showing up or a fleet of Class 8 trucks showing up that need to be charged and they want charging in 9 months, it's going to be pretty tough if we have to put in a substation to serve them. And so we've really got to get synced up with our customers to see the demand so we can be proactive in building out. We've done a lot of studies looking at where the biggest load growth will happen across our territory. We look at the ports of Long Beach and LA. We look at the transportation corridors coming out of there, heading out into the warehouses in Ontario and Imperial in the IE. looking at that load growth, that's where we know we have to build and supplement our infrastructure. And so that's where we're developing the plans to do it. So I think that we absolutely can be ready. We need help, and we need to hurry up.
Is that message resonating with legislators and regulatory bodies and so on? Is the urgency there?
It's getting there, and that has been a journey in itself, I'd say. When we first put out our first view of what 2045 needed to look like 5-6 years ago, really we were the only utility in the nation talking about this volume and this amount of change that needed to happen. We also had our forecast, and we were sharing them with our Energy Commission and our regulators, saying, this is what we believe the demand's going to look like. Here are the things that need to happen. It's taken us 3 or 4 years to get the state planning more synced up with our view of what is going to happen. But we're there now. The Energy Commission now has the amount of electric vehicles embedded in their forecast that the governor is saying need to happen. So they're getting in their forecast. It takes some time to run its way through the planning process, because in our state, the planning for our infrastructure is done across multiple agencies. And so you've got to make sure you're bringing them all along. It's taken a number of years. We're there. Proceedings that our regulators were running that used to talk about, well, who should run the distribution system? There should be an operator, and maybe it's an independent, maybe it's the utility. That's not what they're talking about now. They're talking about what can we do to make sure that the infrastructure is getting built. So I do think that the tone has changed. I think it's still a realization of all the things that have to happen to make it go.
Okay. You've articulated many aspects of your strategy going forward. How does that differ from other utilities, both in the state and across the country?
Sure. I think it starts with the difference in our company from other utilities. And so Southern California Edison is electric only. Many of our peers have electricity and natural gas service. That makes a big difference, frankly, on their willingness to go down a heavy electrification path. When we put out our first papers around this in 2017 of what needed to happen, some of my peers across the nation would call and say, hey, we agree with your view of what needs to happen. We can't get that through our management. We've got a gas company, right? Mm-hmm. So that impacts the strategies that have happened, that the companies are taking on. The other part that impacts us is, I mentioned before, we don't own our generation. We are almost strictly a wires company. We've got distribution, we've got transmission. We take the electrons from somebody else and we deliver them to customers. A lot of companies have generation, and so trends around distributed energy resource adoption, solar, batteries, that impacts their generation fleet. So I'd say we're a little bit unburdened by some of those, by those factors that frankly put us uniquely centered on the solutions that California needs, right? California's on the forefront of looking at decarbonization, looking at electrification. All the policies that the state has put forth, they're good for our business, they're good for our customers. And so I'd say we're in the fortunate position of being very aligned with what our regulators and our policymakers want to do.
Okay, great. I want to follow up on the resiliency point you made earlier, because you alluded to some of them, but climate-related issues and drought, fire, and all these other things are happening at increasingly high rates. And we went through this storm in this last week. This, I'm sure, introduces extraordinary operational issues. And you discussed some of the things that you're doing to improve resiliency. Can you talk about how that theme is infused through the operations of the company?
Yeah, definitely. And maybe I'll start with just talking about wildfire and how we've had to respond to that. In 2017 and 18, we had PG&E up north had some really large fires. We had some pretty large fires ourselves that were extremely impactful to our communities. Loss of life, loss of homes, billions of dollars of damage, and then we're still dealing with the downstream effects of that. But what we saw across the state, and it wasn't just the utility infrastructure related ones, it was just fires in general, just the explosive growth. You see these like fire tornadoes happening, and just the climate was telling us you have to do something differently than you've done before. And so I think as a infrastructure provider, we have to look at the infrastructure and say, what do we need to do differently? Downstream, yes, we have to deal with the operations, but it starts with making sure that the infrastructure can withstand what's coming. On wildfires, that meant, in our high fire areas, it's about a quarter to a third of our territory. We've got a lot of overhead lines, bare conductor, exposed to the elements. squirrels touch it, or palm fronds fly into it. You name it, you get sparks, it starts fires. How do you avoid that? The main element of our grid hardening strategy is around replacing that bare conductor with an insulated wire. We call it covered conductor. Over the last 5 years, we have about 10,000 overhead line miles in high fire areas. We've now installed covered conductor on more than 5,500 of those miles. So more than half of our line miles already are covered. We start with the highest risk areas first and work our way down to the less risky areas. So it's getting the infrastructure hardened, and that's just for wildfire. We're looking at studies of, okay, what needs to happen with heavy floods? What do we need to do differently with our infrastructure? What about in extreme temperatures? In extreme temperatures, wires don't conduct as much electricity. They don't move as much electricity. So you have to then take that into account of, I don't get as many megawatts through a line as I did when it's normal ambient 72 degrees out there. So these are things that our engineers take in and we plan for. You build in more slack into the grid. So first is getting your grid ready, making sure you've got all the right tools from an infrastructure perspective. Then it's the operations, because you can't get your grid ready fast enough and you can't solve for everything. So with wildfires, what that originally resulted in for customers was a challenge, and that was our public safety power shutoffs, where we knew we had exposed lines out there. We'd go, we inspect them, we make sure they're in as good a shape as possible, but inevitably something would hit and you would have sparks. And so we wanted to look at when the wind was super high, when it was super dry, when you were in those really intense fire potential times, we might have to de-energize customers. So to protect the communities that are there. And that was not a popular thing the first couple of years we did it. Mm-hmm. We had, I think in our first big year, in one of the outages, we had probably about 125,000 customers out. Up north, they were closer to 750,000 customers out. And these are not like, I turn you off for an hour. These could be you're out for a day or two or even more at times. So that was a whole adjustment to how we run our operations, how we think about risk, how we embed risk into the operations. Then you fine tune it over time. You get sensors on the grid, you get weather stations out there so you see specifically where the weather's at. You get better at forecasting so that you can target down. Today we do 95% less PSPS than we did just 4 years ago. So great strides there, but you have to change how you're responding to these. So a lot more situational awareness to whatever the weather elements that are coming. And then we're more prepared for it. We're not just in our standard operation. Every district in our territory runs it. We have central command. We have incident management teams stood up. We exercise them throughout the year. We have large rotations of people. These are big changes to moving from silos that operate different parts of the grid to a coordinated network and how we run things in the operation. That same capability applies whether we are looking at fire weather conditions or whether we're looking at weather like we did this week, or in the unfortunate event, the big earthquake strikes in California someday, we're ready to come in and know how we're going to manage our operations. So that's been a big change to how we run our operations, as well as the investment that we've had to do in the grid and how we change the grid.
Listening to you, there's a theme that we have at the school and that we're trying to build through the curriculum that I think you are almost uniquely able to speak to, and that is the many different constituencies that you serve and that you have to appeal to. Mm-hmm. And we all know there's kind of a broader kind of movement around ESG and thinking about all stakeholders rather than just maximizing value to shareholders. And I'm hearing you speak, and there's shareholders that you're concerned about, but you have regulators, the environment, broadly communities mm-hmm. That you serve. Yep. How do you balance what often seem like a set of conflicting objectives?
Yeah. So I think you have to start with finding the most areas of common ground, right? And find areas where it's not conflicting and really focus on those. So we're in a fortunate place where our investors, so the shareholders, frankly benefit from where we sit in supporting decarbonization. If the plans of the state are to electrify and put more clean electricity through the state, and that's going to take more infrastructure, well, that's our business. That's what we're in, and that's what our investors want. They want to see growth in that infrastructure. There is more growth in the infrastructure in California than anyone could ever dream of working through. And so from an investment perspective, I think the investors are actually aligned with the policymakers on where we need to go, which isn't always the case, but we've got that fortunate place in California and we need to leverage that. That also means that we have to go to our policymakers and our regulators and say, hey, and they recognize it now, you need healthy utilities, which means we need to be financially viable. The amount of money that has to come into the state to make this happen is tremendous. You need capital markets to make that go, right? So by 2045, just looking at the distribution, transmission, and generation investments needed in the state, it's about $370 billion. That's a lot of investment and capital that's going to need to show up to support that. And so finding those areas of commonality and getting agreement is the most important part. And so we've got that in our, what I'd say, our core strategy. Other elements, the clean energy transition and affordability. There's a lot of messages out there that say, look at rates going up in California, clean energy is not affordable. For SCE, that's not what's driving rates up, right? So I'll acknowledge our rates have gone up a lot over the last 4 years. We've had double-digit rate increases 4 years in a row, which is no place we want to be with our customers. But the reason for it has not been because we put more solar on the grid. It's not because there's more wind on the grid. The reason is we've had to invest in our infrastructure to protect our communities from wildfires, right? And so it's been the wildfire investment that's been the primary driver of rate increases for the last 4 years. We're getting to a hump where we'll have made those investments, and now we have to make other investments to support the clean energy transition. But we are going to have to spend to get there. The payoff in our pathway of what we see in 2045, by 2045, we expect that customers' total energy costs will actually go down by 40%, which sounds counterintuitive when I talk about double-digit rate increases for your electric utility right now. But what you're getting in this transition is people are going to spend more on electricity. That's going to be where more of their energy is going into. It's into electricity. You get to 90% electrified vehicles, you don't have a gas bill anymore, right? So gasoline consumption goes away. Your natural gas consumption drops by more than half. So you look out there, and if we can manage the electric bill effectively and make the most of those investments, we do believe that customers' total energy cost, electricity plus natural gas plus gasoline, will go down by 40%. Now we have to figure out how do we manage from here to there. And that's what we're working on, is doing that as efficiently as possible. So our job is to find the most efficient way to get the electrons transferred. I don't want to build 10 times as many distribution circuits or 4 times as many transmission lines. Maybe we can do it with 2 to 3 times as many transmission lines and 5 times as many distribution lines by bringing innovation into the solutions. How do we build the grid differently, put more electrons through the same lines, change the technology there so that we're more efficient in the infrastructure that we're deploying? So really, that like dealing with the different stakeholders, it's finding those common areas where sometimes they might seem in conflict, like in the near term or initially, but when you really work it through, there's common ground where everybody can win, and that's what we're looking for.
That target, 40% reduced costs when you take into consideration the whole ecosystem. Are other states in the country looking at you, and other utilities looking at you as a model of kind of the mix of technologies we're going to be needing to use going forward?
I would say that it's an industry that learns from each other for sure. I think this picture, our picture of what needs to happen in the state, the things we're doing, absolutely, many states are looking at it. Sometimes there's political divides that drive very different agendas on what the right answer is. But this one's actually, in some cases, crossing those political divides because it's good for business, it's good for customers as well in the long run. So people are looking at it. Being in California, it's not just us. Being in California, you were forced to be some of the first movers and try a lot more out. So people do look at it and watch. There's a lot of groups that'll be fast followers or slow followers, depending upon how they see it taking shape. Electric vehicle adoption is happening a lot faster in California than it is anywhere else, right? 1 in 4 new vehicle sales in the state is electric. So I think others will come along. They absolutely do come and they want to listen and learn. It doesn't mean they do everything we do. When I think about the resources needed, different states can tap into different resources. You don't have as much wind and solar everywhere, but you've got other resources in other places that they can tap into. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier the massive capital requirements for this infrastructure growth. Obviously, the public markets will be one source of it. What are going to be the other main sources of capital for this infrastructure growth?
Yeah. So federal government's putting a lot of money into it right now, right, through the IIJA, IRA, different programs to really incent and drive changes to the infrastructure across, our industry and other industries. But a lot of it is going to have to come back to, we're going to tap into capital markets, right? So we're an investor-owned utility. We're going to be raising capital to support the infrastructure growth, and we serve. We, PG&E San Diego, serve more than 80% of the load in the state. And so that is our model and how we go out and get funds. We will absolutely take other funds available as much as possible to help pay for it. But that's kind of where money comes from. Similarly, even on the, we're focused on the renewables that are connected to the grid itself. Customers are adopting technology, right? So how are you paying for the rooftop solar and the batteries behind people's homes and their EV chargers? There's other markets that are helping drive a lot of that, but consumers are paying for a lot of it.
I'm going to switch gears a bit and ask some more personal questions.
Okay.
You've spent your entire 25-year career at Southern California Edison, and I'm wondering what's kept you there? What's kept you passionate about being at SCE?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. It's definitely changed over time. You go through different parts of your career and you focus on different things. But let me start with this. At Edison, our number one value, most important thing in what we do is safety and driving. It's safety of our employees. It's safety of our communities. And over the last number of years, we're trying to shift our culture to focus a lot more on everybody has to own their safety, right? And it's not saying you're on your own, but it starts with you have to have an intrinsic desire to stay safe and make the safest choices. So we provide people tools. One of those tools that we use is our PB5, not peanut butter, personal best 5. I love peanut butter. But the PB5, the concept is like, why do you stay safe, right? Most people don't stay safe because they want to go to work, right? You work so that you can do other things and enjoy. I love work, but that's not the reason I stay safe for the most part. So my PB5 is, I'm gonna go through them quickly. 1 is family, 2 is sports, 3 is travel, 4 is the people at Edison, and 5 is our mission, right? So the reasons that I make safe choices, that I want others to make safe choices, are those 5 things. So first, my family, my wife, Melinda, and my son, Keegan, are here. So thanks for joining. That's an obvious one. If it's not in somebody's PB5, I'd be surprised. Sports, born and raised in LA, Dodgers, Lakers, Bruins, love sports. Travel, my favorite travel destination ever was on my honeymoon, going to South Africa and going on safari. But someday I still want to go to Antarctica. So I gotta live for that. But the last 2 are around our company, right? Being there for 25 years, the people, the relationships you build, the network you build, and the values we have at our company, right? Our values are safety, respect, integrity, continuous improvement, teamwork, and excellence. Those resonate with me, and they are embedded in the people in our organization. And so that's a huge reason why I want to stay safe, is to do everything I can to help our teams, and because I love working with the people I work with. The other one's the mission. When I started at the company, our mission was to safely deliver reliable electricity to our customers, right? Pretty simple, and probably what every utility wants to do over time. Now it's evolved. Now it's safely deliver clean electricity affordably to our customers over time. I've had the opportunity to work on our company strategies since 2007 in various ways. Part of it, lead it, you name it. Our mission is right, we're embedded in our communities. We power the lives and we power society and the growth in society. The opportunity to do that in a way that helps lead the planet to a better place and how we power society is exciting. And so the change in our industry over the next 21 years is an extreme challenge. I'm an engineer by education, not by actual work, but solving problems is what I've always loved to do. In the first 10 years of my career, it was about solving problems. That shifted over the years in terms of what really keeps me at the company. But it comes back to, like, I want to succeed in this mission, and I want us to succeed, and then the people that I work with.
So how would you describe your leadership style and how it's evolved over time?
That has changed a lot too. Biggest change And leadership depends on who you're leading, the types of group you're leading, whether you're leading individuals or leading leaders. Biggest change for me and where I focus, I find today, my leadership, it's important that I put the right leadership team in place, that I bring the right people in, that I get them aligned, that we've got a common mission, and that we work well together and they're good leaders. And then I have to trust them to do their jobs well. It is a big, complex organization with a lot of different functions, and I can't do their jobs, right? So Larry Chung's here. I would be terrible in local public affairs, and he can vouch for it. He helps me out a lot. There are so many different things to a business like this that I can't do everything. Now that is different than when I started as a leader. When I started as a leader, my first management job, anything my team did, I redid, right? Because I was like, I have to understand it or I have to redo it. And I drove them absolutely nuts. And for many years, I worked in small teams where I probably could redo a lot of work, or I had the capacity to do a lot of it. And so I was too much micromanaging, way too leaning into it. I learned over time that was not the way to develop them. It was not the way to get the best results. And certainly it's impossible for me to do it now. So really it's that identify the right leaders, coach them, mentor them, and learn from them too, because every single one of them knows a lot more about what they do than I do.
Great. And before I get to the student questions, one last question. I usually end my questioning with this one. What career advice would you give our graduates who are looking to get into the industry now? What skills do you think are the most important to their success?
Yeah. The specific technical skills or job skills, I would almost say it doesn't matter. We need everything, right? We have so many facets to our business. Yes, we'd love to have more data scientists or people that know how to lead data scientists and know programming those things. That's a great part. Bringing artificial intelligence into the business, figuring out ways to leverage that, awesome. We need people that know how to really drive an operation, right? Operational improvement, process focus, or technology deployment and how you embed that and get the most of it across a company with more than 13,000 employees, 50,000 square miles. Like, operations at scale is really valuable. But we have to engage with our regulators and policymakers. So we need advocates, we need people that think about policy and strategy. So from a functional skill, we need a little bit of everything. The biggest areas of growth, innovation and engineering to plan out that grid of the future is a huge area. And we know we're gonna need a lot more talent there over time. And so that's all great. Now you're coming into, it is not your grandfather's electric utility or even industry. When I started 24 years ago, it was a sleepy utility that we thought we did interesting stuff, but people weren't excited to go work for utilities or even in the energy space. It's nothing like that anymore. Anybody that is joining is in for a wild ride. And so you need change advocates, right? You need people that know how to drive change, drive to result, and lead teams through that change. Because our industry, our company, grew up over more than 100 years. And we've got families, literally family networks throughout the company of husbands and wives and children and grandparents that have all worked at the company. And that breeds sometimes a culture of comfort with the status quo, and that's something that needs to change. So we need different thinking, we need people that can drive change, but people that can also help, that have empathy and EQ to help manage through change.
You know, I've got a little smile on my face. Our strategic positioning is around transformative leaders. Okay. And these are individuals who can solve complex business problems, but can catalyze an organization into action and lead empathetically and purposefully. And
sounds like we need those.
Yeah, I was going to say that sounds pretty much what we are thinking we need to develop in our students. So thank you for that. I have a few questions from students who sent these to me in advance. If you could change one thing about the current energy landscape in California, what would it be and why?
This may not be the most popular one to all stakeholders out there, but my view is we have over-engineered our markets and we have over-engineered the complexity in our industry. We've added lots of third-party providers of all sorts of resource technologies that we have to connect to. We've added community choice aggregation and direct access and energy service providers. We have, we've chunked the business out, transmissions here, distributions there, and they were all for noble causes and reasons. They drive competition. They, frankly, de-scope some of what is regulated and provide opportunity for open markets. I think we have to look and see if that's what is going to get us there in the next 20 years. With the amount of infrastructure, the amount of coordination that's going to be required across states, counties, cities, across different entities, it's becoming very difficult to navigate and coordinate, and I think it is dry. There's not enough resources or time to manage it all. So areas where you can centralize decision-making, centralize planning, frankly, areas where you can be clear on who's going to do the work and just tell them to go instead of continually having to go back and make it more competitive, bring more companies in. So, I wouldn't say you re-vertically integrate utilities, but I think you have to look at who decide who are the ones that are really going to get this done, because we can't just let all comers come in and compete and make things go. I'm not anti-competitive, but I do think we've got a mission to drive, and the state is going to have to decide how we get it done and do things differently than we've done it before. And so that's the part about our industry and our state that I think needs some rethinking. And it starts with our policymakers and our regulators. Do we have too many entities, too many people that can overrule each other with different objectives? And so you've got to decide, is it carbon reduction or is it land management and land use, right? Those things are going to be in conflict and aren't going to be perfectly there. And so if you can have one agency that says, go build this stuff, and another agency that then steps in and says, yeah, but you've got to protect this land and these toads and these birds, and so you can't build anywhere, that doesn't solve. We're going to have to figure out who's going to make decisions to solve this.
Great. Here's a question. I alluded to a little bit on this when we spoke about the grid and having access to charging stations, for example, in EV throughout the state rather than just in urban areas. Are there aspects of regional inequality in energy access and affordability that are relevant to Southern California Edison's strategic efforts?
Absolutely. When I think about the long term and that objective of 2045, if you're going to get 90% of vehicles electrified or 95% of buildings electrified, that means everybody's doing it. And so our strategy depends on everybody doing it. The more you have haves and have-nots, the more, inequalities, the more you have those that can't afford things paying for those that can afford things, because the grid is something that everybody's tapping into and everybody's using, and you can't just have that on the backs of those that couldn't afford the better technologies. And so we have to think about equity and equality across all of our territory, as well as in every program we do. So it's in how we design our rates, have to look at equity and how we do that. New programs, when we've got programs, whether it's rolling out energy efficiency, supporting electric vehicle charging, any of those, there's a portion of that, usually in the ballpark of 50% of the investment that is targeted at disadvantaged communities, low income or environmentally sensitive communities, because we know we have to make the investments happen there, and they don't have enough funding. We do things, we were a huge proponent and really pushed at the federal level to get in the vehicle incentives, to get the second use rebate for electric vehicles, to get it to be available to and larger for low-income customers. So it's those sorts of things that we're putting in our programs and then pushing those at the federal level so that everyone's thinking about how do you bring everyone along in this. And so it does go into everything we think about in terms of our infrastructure. Climate adaptation, you talked about resiliency. We are required to, but we do a full climate adaptation vulnerability assessment, which is looking at the impact of flooding and heat and fires and everything else on our infrastructure and operations. We're looking for vulnerabilities, and the way we would prioritize investments in what we do is through engagement with our communities. And so as we go through that process, we engage with our disadvantaged communities to understand what does their climate resiliency plan look like? How are they going to be changing? Are they going to be changing? There's been a lot of education that needs to be done. but then having that then inform where do we make, where do we prioritize our investments, because some of our most vulnerable communities are the ones that aren't going to be able to adjust, and they're going to be most impacted as climate changes.
Great. We talked a little bit about funding these large infrastructure investments. What role do you see for alternative sources of capital like private equity in this development?
Yeah. So private equity is playing in our industry today, right? They pick up and they, on the, whether it's solar companies, private equity plays a lot in some of the distributed resource technologies. Private equity is also playing in the infrastructure. And so not as much on the distribution grid, but the transmission grid, a lot of new transmission in the state is actually competitive. And so we have to compete. We don't have the right of first refusal on all projects in the state now. If it's upgrades to the existing system that we own, we go do those upgrades. But for all the new lines, those get bid out and are competitive. A lot of private equity has developed, either partnering or has developed companies to go after that. It's a nice, steady, great revenue stream, and it's strong business if you can win it. So you see a lot of private equity getting into the investments in the grid infrastructure as well. So I think with the amount of investment that needs to happen, we do need to look at every angle we can. And I think the private equity is looking at what are those opportunities that fit best for them with the really strong returns that just need a bunch of capital infusion, or at times it's more on the customer side programs.
Great. So I'll conclude the student questions by asking, you're a graduate of our fully employed MBA program. Mm-hmm. How did it help you in your career? How did it help you in key decisions that you had to make as a leader?
Yeah. Well, I will say it helped me in my career because I worked while I did it and I got to apply it, right? So fully employed. So I got to apply it while I was there. It was interesting. I didn't expect it to be that way, but it was everything from my finance courses to my strategy courses. I was able to apply it throughout the 3 years I was in school. And so frankly, I think I learned more because I was getting to do both along the way. It also helped. It was a different place to, let's say, practice leadership, right? I had my team. I had my teams that I ran at the company. I had project teams. I had management teams. But I didn't, it was almost like a separate little sandbox to go take some different leadership approaches and learn a little bit more about myself with my peers in the class, experience their leadership, give them feedback, them experience my leadership, and them give me feedback in a way where it wasn't bound by some of the constraints and pains that you get in a company where you have a performance, you have a performance development program and you're giving formal feedback to somebody that's scoring you or vice versa, that frankly filters a lot of that feedback. And so for me, from a leadership perspective, a lot of it was getting, 3 years working with very different people from different industries, but to get real feedback on what am I doing right, what's working, what's not working. That's probably what I learned the most over time.
Well, great. Well, Steven, this was extraordinarily informative. We're so grateful for you taking time out of I'm sure, an incredibly busy schedule. We're very proud that you're an alum.
Thank you.
And we're very proud that you're tackling large societal issue with the drive and passion that you are. So thank you so much on behalf of all of us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.